I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Brenda Patterson standing at my front door with her clipboard, and that tight-lipped expression that meant trouble was about to rain down on my peaceful Saturday morning. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I'm here to inform you of a very serious violation." I stood there in my flannel shirt and jeans, coffee mug in hand, trying to process what violation she could possibly be talking about. My name is Greg Reynolds, and I had lived in Silverbrook Estates in Boulder, Colorado for 3 years without a single issue. I kept my lawn immaculate, my house painted in the approved color palette, and I even volunteered for the neighborhood cleanup days. Whatever this was, it had to be a mistake. "What violation?" I asked, genuinely confused. Brenda gestured dramatically toward my backyard with her free hand, the other clutching that clipboard like it was the Bible itself. "The firewood, Mr. Reynolds. The excessive, unsightly stockpiling of firewood on your property. It violates Section 7.4 of our HOA covenant, which clearly states that no homeowner may store materials in quantities that detract from the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood." I followed her gaze to my backyard, where I had spent the better part of the last 3 months carefully stacking cord after cord of seasoned oak and pine. The wood was neatly arranged, covered with tarps, and positioned against my back fence. It was not visible from the street. You would have to deliberately walk into my backyard or peer over my fence to even see it. "That firewood isn't visible from the street," I said, keeping my voice level. "And I need it. I use my fireplace as my primary heat source during the winter. You know how cold it gets here." "Be that as it may," Brenda said, adjusting her glasses. "The rules are the rules. You have accumulated approximately 8 cords of wood, which is far beyond what any reasonable person would need for a single winter season. This is clearly hoarding behavior, and the board has voted to fine you $500, with an additional $250 per week until the excess wood is removed." My jaw dropped. 8 cords isn't hoarding. It's called being prepared. Last winter, the propane prices went through the roof, and plenty of people couldn't afford to heat their homes properly. I'm just making sure my family stays warm without breaking the bank. "You don't have a family, Mr. Reynolds," Brenda said coldly. "You live alone." "That's beside the point," I shot back, feeling my temper starting to rise. "This is my property. That wood is neatly stacked and maintained. It's not hurting anyone." Brenda pulled a pink slip of paper from her clipboard and thrust it toward me. "Here is your official notice of violation and fine. You have 14 days to reduce your firewood supply to no more than 1 cord. After that, the fines will begin accruing. Have a nice day, Mr. Reynolds." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there holding the pink slip and my now cold coffee. I wanted to crumple the paper and throw it after her, but I knew that would only make things worse. Instead, I went inside, slammed the door harder than necessary, and spent the next hour researching HOA law in Colorado. The more I read, the angrier I became. Technically, Brenda and her board of busybodies had the authority to enforce aesthetic standards, but their interpretation seemed deliberately vindictive. Nothing in the covenant specifically addressed firewood storage quantities. They were using a vague clause about materials and aesthetic harmony to target me specifically. I decided to call my neighbor, Tom Martinez, who had served on the HOA board years ago before quitting in frustration. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Tom, it's Greg. I need some advice about dealing with Brenda Patterson and the HOA." Tom groaned audibly. "What did she do now?" I explained the situation, and Tom listened quietly until I finished. Then he sighed deeply. "Listen, Greg, I hate to say this, but fighting the HOA is like fighting quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. That woman has nothing better to do than enforce rules that nobody else cares about. When I was on the board, she tried to fine Mrs. Chen for having the wrong shade of white on her mailbox. White, Greg. She measured it with a color wheel. So I should just pay the fine and get rid of my firewood. I didn't say that, Tom replied. I'm saying pick your battles carefully. Document everything. Take photos. Keep every email and letter. If you're going to fight this, you need to be smarter than she is. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the weekend photographing my firewood from every angle, documenting how it was not visible from any public area, and researching similar cases in Colorado. I found several instances where HOA overreach had been successfully challenged in court, but it always took time and money. Still, the principle mattered. I had done nothing wrong. Monday morning, I drafted a formal response to the HOA board, outlining my position and requesting a hearing to dispute the fine. I cited specific case law and included my photographic evidence. I dropped it off at the HOA management office downtown and hoped for the best. The response came 3 days later, delivered by certified mail. The board had denied my request for a hearing, upheld the fine, and reminded me that failure to comply would result in additional penalties, potentially including a lien on my property. I was furious. This was not just about firewood anymore. It was about property rights and the abuse of petty authority. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which was open to all residents, and make my case publicly. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening at the Silverbrook Community Center, a bland beige building that matched the bland beige mentality of the people who ran it. I arrived early and took a seat in the front row. About 20 other residents trickled in, most of them looking as thrilled to be there as people waiting for dental surgery. Brenda Patterson sat at the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other board members who all looked like they had been assembled in the same factory that produced suburban conformity. There was Richard Hoffman, a retired accountant who treated every discussion like a budget review. Next to him sat Susan Carmichael, a real estate agent who viewed the neighborhood entirely through the lens of property values. Then came Paul Zhang, who rarely spoke but nodded along with whatever Brenda said. Finally, there was Linda Mayer, who at least occasionally showed signs of independent thought. Brenda called the meeting to order and began droning through the minutes from the previous meeting. I waited impatiently through discussions about pool maintenance, landscaping contracts, and a lengthy debate about whether the neighborhood entrance sign needed repainting. Finally, she reached the homeowner concerns section of the agenda. Are there any homeowner concerns? She asked, clearly hoping there would not be. I stood up. Yes, I would like to address the board about the firewood storage fine. Brenda's expression hardened. Mr. Reynolds, the board has already reviewed and ruled on your violation. There is nothing further to discuss. With all due respect, Mrs. Patterson, you denied my request for a hearing without cause. I have the right to present my case to the board and the community. Several residents murmured in agreement. Brenda looked like she had just bitten into a lemon, but she could not refuse without looking like the tyrant she was. Very well, she said. You have 3 minutes. I pulled out my notes and began. 3 months ago, I began purchasing and storing firewood for the upcoming winter. I did this for economic and practical reasons. Last winter, propane and natural gas prices increased significantly. My heating bills were over $300 per month. By using my fireplace as my primary heat source, I can reduce that cost by more than half. I held up my photographs. As you can see, the firewood is neatly stacked against my back fence. It is not visible from the street. It does not create any safety hazard, It does not violate any specific provision of our covenant. The board is using a vague aesthetic clause to fine me $500 for being prepared for winter. Susan Carmichael leaned forward. Mr. Reynolds, while I understand your reasoning, you must consider how this impacts property values. Excessive storage of materials, even if not visible from the street, sets a precedent that could lead to other homeowners engaging in similar behavior. Similar behavior like being prepared for winter, I asked. Like trying to save money on heating costs. That seems like responsible homeownership to me. Richard Hoffman cleared his throat. The issue is not your intentions, Mr. Reynolds. The issue is compliance with our established rules. We cannot make exceptions, or the entire system breaks down. Then change the rules, I said. Amend the covenant to specifically address firewood storage with reasonable limits. 1 cord is not enough for someone who uses wood as their primary heat source. It's arbitrary and unreasonable. Brenda cut in before anyone else could speak. Your 3 minutes are up, Mr. Reynolds. The board has made its decision. The fine stands. Please take your seat. I sat down, my face burning with frustration. Linda Mayer raised her hand hesitantly. I think Mr. Reynolds makes some valid points, she said. Perhaps we should consider forming a committee to review the covenant language regarding storage. Noted, Brenda said dismissively. We'll take that under advisement. Now, moving on to new business. The rest of the meeting was a blur. I sat there stewing in my anger, barely listening to discussions about Halloween decoration policies and parking restrictions. When the meeting finally adjourned, I approached Linda Mayer. Thank you for speaking up, I said. She smiled sympathetically. I think Brenda is being unreasonable, but she has the other board members convinced that any deviation from strict enforcement will lead to chaos. I'll keep pushing for a review, but I can't promise anything. Over the next 2 weeks, I reluctantly began reducing my firewood supply. I sold 3 cords to neighbors and friends, keeping my prices fair even though I knew I could have charged more. The irony was not lost on me that several of the people who bought my wood lived in Silverbrook Estates. Apparently, I was not the only one concerned about heating costs. I managed to get my supply down to about 4 cords, which I argued was a reasonable compromise. It was more than the 1 cord limit Brenda demanded, but significantly less than the 8 I had accumulated. I documented the reduction with photographs and submitted them to the HOA office, along with a letter requesting that the fine be reduced or waived given my good faith compliance effort. The response was swift and uncompromising. The fine was upheld in full, and I was informed that I still had too much firewood. The weekly penalties would begin accruing unless I reduced to 1 cord within 48 hours. I paid the initial $500 fine under protest, but I refused to pay the weekly penalties. Let them take me to court. I had principles, and I was not going to be bullied by a petty tyrant with a clipboard. October rolled into November, and the weather in Boulder started to turn cold. The first snow came early that year, dusting the Rockies with white and sending temperatures plummeting. I fired up my fireplace and enjoyed the warmth of my carefully seasoned oak, feeling vindicated in my decision to stockpile. Then, in mid-November, news broke that sent shockwaves through our community and much of Colorado. A major propane distribution facility in Commerce City had suffered a catastrophic equipment failure. The facility supplied a significant portion of the Front Range, and repairs were expected to take at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. The timing could not have been worse. Winter was settling in, and thousands of households relied on propane for heating, cooking, and hot water. Within days, propane prices skyrocketed. What had been $2 per gallon jumped to 5, then 6, then 8. Worse, supply became severely limited. Propane companies began rationing deliveries, prioritizing emergency services and vulnerable populations. Regular homeowners were told to conserve and prepare for potential service interruptions. The local news ran stories about families struggling to stay warm. Hardware stores sold out of space heaters within hours. The city opened warming centers for people who could not afford the inflated propane costs or who ran out entirely. In Silverbrook Estates, the mood shifted from suburban complacency to genuine concern. People who had never given a second thought to their heating costs were suddenly facing bills of $600, $700, even $800 for a single month. And that was if they could get propane delivered at all. My phone started ringing. First it was Tom Martinez, asking if I had any firewood I could spare. Then it was the Hendersons from 3 houses down. Then the Patels. Then the Johnsons. People I barely knew were reaching out, desperate for an alternative heat source. I helped where I could, selling or even giving away wood to neighbors who were truly struggling. But I kept enough for myself. After all, this was exactly why I had prepared in the first place. Then, on a cold Tuesday morning in late November, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Brenda Patterson standing there, but this time without her clipboard. She looked uncomfortable, almost nervous. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her voice lacking its usual edge, "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "What do you want, Brenda?" I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. She cleared her throat. "I wanted to discuss a possible solution to your firewood situation. The board has been reconsidering our position and we think there may be room for negotiation." I almost laughed. Negotiation? You mean now that there's a propane shortage, you suddenly don't care about aesthetic harmony? A flash of anger crossed her face, but she suppressed it. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand you're upset, but let's be reasonable. The board is prepared to waive all outstanding fines if you would be willing to sell some of your remaining firewood to other residents in the community." "I've already been selling firewood to people who asked," I said. "What do you really want?" Brenda shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with whatever she was about to say. "The board would also like to purchase firewood from you for our own needs. We're prepared to pay premium prices, triple the current market rate." There it was, the real reason for her visit. Brenda and her fellow board members had built their comfortable lives on the assumption that utilities would always flow cheaply and reliably. Now they were cold and scared, and they were willing to pay through the nose for the very thing they had fined me for having. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You fined me $500 for stockpiling firewood. You threatened me with weekly penalties and potential liens on my property. You publicly humiliated me at a board meeting. And now you want to buy my firewood at triple the market rate because you didn't prepare and I did." "I wouldn't characterize it as humiliation," Brenda said defensively. "We were simply enforcing the rules. Rules you're suddenly happy to ignore when they're inconvenient for you," I shot back. Brenda's facade cracked. "Look, Mr. Reynolds, I'm asking nicely. We can compensate you well for your wood. Everyone benefits. You make money and we stay warm. What's the problem?" "The problem is you're a hypocrite," I said. "You and your board spent months making my life miserable over something that turned out to be smart planning. You want my firewood? Fine. But it's going to cost you a lot more than triple market rate." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "First, the HOA issues a written apology for the fine and the harassment. Second, the fine is refunded in full. Third, the covenant is amended to allow reasonable firewood storage of up to 10 cords. And fourth, yes, I'll sell you wood, but at 5 times the current market rate, not 3. Brenda's face turned red. That's extortion. No, that's capitalism, I replied. Supply and demand. I have something you need and I'm setting the price. Take it or leave it. She stood there sputtering for a moment, then turned and stormed off my porch without another word. I closed the door and allowed myself a satisfied smile. It felt good to finally have the upper hand, but my satisfaction was short-lived. The next day, I received a letter from the HOA attorney threatening legal action if I did not comply with the original violation notice. They were also accusing me of price gouging and attempting to manipulate the board. I called my own attorney, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in HOA disputes. I explained the entire situation, from the original fine to Brenda's visit to the new legal threats. Jennifer listened carefully, then said, "They don't have a case. You're a private citizen selling your own property. You can charge whatever you want. As for the violation, we can argue that their selective enforcement constitutes harassment. But here's what I think you should do. Don't sell them anything, not at any price." "Why not?" I asked. "Because the longer this drags out, the worse they look and the stronger your position becomes. They created this mess by targeting you for being prepared. Let them live with the consequences. In the meantime, document every interaction, keep all correspondence, and wait. They're going to overreach, and when they do, we'll have them." I took Jennifer's advice. When individual board members called asking to buy wood, I politely declined. When Brenda sent increasingly desperate emails, I forwarded them to Jennifer without responding. When Richard Hoffman showed up at my door offering cash, I told him I was not interested in selling to board members. The propane situation worsened as December arrived. The distribution facility repairs were taking longer than expected. The company announced that service would not be fully restored until January at the earliest. Propane prices hit $10 per gallon, and many suppliers simply stopped taking new orders. The community was in crisis. Families were keeping their thermostats at 55 degrees and wearing winter coats indoors. Some people left town entirely, staying with relatives until the shortage ended. The local government declared a state of emergency and began coordinating relief efforts. Through it all, I stayed warm and comfortable in my home, burning the firewood I had been punished for storing. The irony was not lost on anyone, especially my neighbors. People stopped me in the grocery store to tell me I had been right all along. Former supporters of the HOA board now openly criticized Brenda and her cohorts for their short-sightedness and vindictiveness. The tide of public opinion was turning, and Brenda knew it. She called an emergency HOA meeting in mid-December to address the crisis. I attended, curious to see how she would spin this disaster. The community center was packed. Every seat was filled and people lined the walls. The mood was tense and angry. These were residents who had paid their HOA fees faithfully, followed the rules, and now found themselves suffering while the board scrambled for solutions. Brenda opened the meeting by acknowledging the propane shortage and outlining steps the HOA was taking to help residents. These included coordinating group purchases of space heaters, organizing carpools to warming centers, and negotiating with propane suppliers for priority delivery. It all sounded impressive until someone in the back shouted, "What about the firewood?" The room erupted in agreement. Multiple people called out, asking why the HOA had prevented residents from preparing for exactly this kind of situation. Brenda tried to maintain control, but the meeting devolved into chaos. "Mr. Reynolds tried to warn us," someone yelled. "The board fined him for being smart." Another voice added, Brenda banged her gavel repeatedly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Order! I will have order!" Slowly, the room quieted down. Brenda took a deep breath and said, "The board made decisions based on the information and rules we had at the time. We cannot change the past. We can only move forward." I stood up. "Moving forward requires accountability. The board needs to admit it made a mistake." "We did not make a mistake," Brenda snapped. "We enforced our covenant, which all of you agreed to when you purchased your homes." "You enforced it selectively and vindictively," I said. "And now everyone is paying the price for your short-sightedness. I'm not the villain here. You are." The room erupted in applause. Brenda looked around wildly, realizing she had lost the support of the community. Linda Mayer leaned over and whispered something to her. Brenda shook her head violently, but Linda persisted. Finally, Richard Hoffman took the microphone. "Perhaps we should table this discussion for now and focus on immediate solutions. Mr. Reynolds, would you be willing to work with the HOA to provide firewood to residents in need?" "I've already been helping neighbors who asked," I said. "But I'm not interested in doing business with the board until my demands are met." "Written apology, refund of the fine, and amendment of the covenant." "That's unreasonable," Brenda shouted. "No, what's unreasonable is fining someone for being prepared and then expecting them to bail you out of your own stupidity," I shot back. The meeting ended without resolution. People filed out, many stopping to shake my hand or express their support. Brenda and the board huddled together, clearly at a loss for how to proceed. Over the next week, the situation reached a boiling point. Several residents circulated a petition calling for the removal of the entire board. Others threatened to stop paying their HOA fees in protest. The local newspaper picked up the story, running an article titled "HOA Hypocrisy Leaves Neighborhood Cold." The article detailed my situation and the broader propane crisis, painting Brenda and the board as out-of-touch bureaucrats more concerned with rules than people. It quoted multiple residents who expressed frustration with HOA overreach. It even included comments from HOA reform advocates, who cited Silverbrook Estates as a prime example of why Colorado needed stronger regulations on homeowners associations. Brenda was furious. She tried to sue the newspaper for defamation, but her attorney advised her that everything in the article was factually accurate. She was a public figure in the context of the HOA, and the criticism was fair comment. Then things took an unexpected turn. In late December, someone broke into my backyard and stole approximately half a cord of firewood. I discovered the theft early one morning when I went outside to grab logs for my fireplace. The tarp had been pulled back, and a significant section of my carefully stacked wood was gone. I immediately called the police. A young officer named Deputy Collins came out to take a report. He examined the scene, took photographs, and asked questions about who might have had motive to steal the wood. "Given the propane shortage, it could be anyone," he said sympathetically. "People are desperate. Do you have any security cameras?" "No," I admitted. "I never thought I'd need them." Deputy Collins suggested I install cameras and be vigilant. He filed his report, but I knew the chances of recovering the wood were essentially zero. That night, I went to the hardware store and bought a comprehensive security camera system. I spent the weekend installing cameras covering my backyard, front yard, and both sides of my property. If someone tried to steal from me again, I would have them on video. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, just after midnight, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera system. I pulled up the app and watched in real time as a figure in dark clothing climbed over my back fence and approached my firewood stack. I called 911 immediately, reporting a burglary in progress. Then I grabbed my own phone and started recording through the app, making sure I had backup footage. The figure was loading wood into a large duffel bag, working quickly but not quickly enough. Within minutes, I heard sirens. The figure in my backyard froze, then tried to run. But Deputy Collins and another officer were already at my back gate, flashlights blazing. The thief was caught. I went outside to witness the arrest. The officers ordered the person to the ground and handcuffed them. When they pulled back the hood of the dark sweatshirt, I was shocked to see Susan Carmichael, the real estate agent from the HOA board. "Susan," I said, genuinely stunned. She wouldn't look at me. Her face was streaked with tears and she was shaking. Deputy Collins read her rights while his partner searched her. They found gloves, a small crowbar, and her car keys. "Mr. Reynolds, do you know this person?" Deputy Collins asked. "She's on the HOA board," I said. "She was one of the people who fined me for having this firewood in the first place." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Susan Carmichael, who had lectured me about property values and community standards, had just been caught stealing the very thing she had tried to force me to get rid of. At the police station, Susan initially refused to talk, but eventually her attorney arrived and worked out a deal. She confessed to both thefts, the one a week ago and the attempted theft tonight. She claimed she was desperate because she couldn't afford propane and was trying to heat her home. Her attorney argued for leniency given the circumstances, but the prosecutor wasn't sympathetic. Susan had committed premeditated burglary, not once but twice. She had specifically targeted someone she had a documented conflict with, making it even worse. The prosecutor charged her with 2 counts of burglary and 1 count of criminal trespass. The news spread through Silverbrook Estates like wildfire. A board member arrested for stealing firewood. The same board that had been so concerned with rules and aesthetics. The hypocrisy was stunning. Brenda tried to do damage control, issuing a statement that Susan's actions were her own and did not reflect the board's values. But nobody was buying it. The petition to remove the board gained even more signatures. People were calling for a special election to replace all board members. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get more absurd, I received a visit from Paul Zhang, another board member. He looked exhausted and defeated. "Mr. Reynolds, can we talk?" he asked. I invited him in, curious about what he wanted. We sat in my living room, the fireplace crackling warmly. "I want to apologize," Paul said quietly. "I should have spoken up when Brenda started targeting you. I knew it was wrong, but I went along with it because I didn't want the conflict. I'm sorry." "I appreciate that," I said, "but an apology from you doesn't fix what the board did." "I know," Paul said. "That's why I'm here. I'm resigning from the board and I'm encouraging Linda Mayer to do the same. Brenda and Richard are too stubborn to admit they were wrong, but the 3 of us can force a special election. With Susan facing criminal charges, the board is already down to 4 members. If Linda and I resign, they can't maintain a quorum. The community will have to hold elections and start fresh." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I want you to consider running for the board," Paul said. "You've shown more integrity and common sense than any of us. The community needs leadership that actually cares about people, not just rules." I hadn't considered running for the HOA board. The whole experience had soured me on the organization, but Paul made a compelling point. If I wanted to prevent future abuse, the best way was to be part of the solution. "Let me think about it," I said. Paul nodded and left. I sat by my fireplace thinking about everything that had happened. The fine, the harassment, the vindication, the theft, the arrest. It had been a wild few months. The next day, I called Jennifer Walsh and asked her opinion about joining the HOA board. "Do it," she said immediately. "You have the moral high ground, community support, and first-hand experience with HOA overreach. You could actually make positive changes." Linda Mayer called me that afternoon to tell me she was resigning and to encourage me to run. She echoed Paul's sentiments, saying the community needed someone like me in leadership. Within a week, both Paul and Linda had officially resigned. The HOA was down to just Brenda Patterson and Richard Hoffman, neither of whom could make decisions without a quorum. A special election was scheduled for mid-January. I announced my candidacy, along with my platform: reasonable rules, transparent governance, and respect for homeowner rights. Several other residents announced their candidacies as well, including Tom Martinez. The election became a referendum on the old board's behavior. Brenda and Richard both ran for re-election, trying to defend their records, but they were fighting an uphill battle. The community was angry, and they wanted change. Meanwhile, Susan Carmichael's legal troubles continued. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation, community service, and restitution. She had to pay me for the stolen firewood plus additional damages. She also resigned from the board and agreed not to run for office again. The propane shortage finally began to ease in early January as the distribution facility completed repairs. Prices slowly came down, and supply stabilized. People who had suffered through the cold months breathed sighs of relief. But nobody forgot what had happened or who had been prepared. Election day arrived on a cold Saturday morning. The turnout was massive. Nearly every household in Silverbrook Estates sent someone to vote. When the results were counted that evening, the message was clear. I received the most votes by a wide margin. Tom Martinez came in second. 3 other reform candidates rounded out the new 5-member board. Brenda Patterson and Richard Hoffman were both voted out decisively. The first meeting of the new board took place a week later. We had a lot of work to do. Our first order of business was addressing the firewood situation. We formally rescinded the fine against me and issued a written apology. We also refunded the $500 I had paid, plus interest. Then we tackled the broader issue. We amended the covenant to allow reasonable storage of firewood up to 10 cords, provided it was neatly stacked and maintained. We also created clearer guidelines for other types of storage, eliminating the vague language that had been used to target me. But we didn't stop there. We reviewed dozens of other rules and regulations, identifying areas where the HOA had been overly restrictive or unreasonable. We updated paint color requirements, relaxed landscaping mandates, and created a more transparent process for handling violations. We also implemented new governance procedures. All board decisions now required public notice and community input. Fines could not be imposed without an opportunity for the homeowner to present their case. And we created an ombudsman position to help resolve disputes before they escalated. The changes were well received. Residents appreciated having a board that listened and acted reasonably. The atmosphere in Silverbrook Estates shifted from fear and resentment to cooperation and community. Brenda Patterson and Richard Hoffman largely disappeared from community life. Brenda still lived in the neighborhood, but she kept to herself and avoided community events. Richard moved away a few months later, citing health reasons. Susan Carmichael completed her community service and paid her restitution. She sent me a handwritten letter apologizing for her actions and explaining that she had been under enormous stress. She lost her real estate license temporarily and had to rebuild her career. I didn't forgive her easily, but I appreciated the effort. As winter turned to spring, life in Silverbrook Estates returned to normal, but it was a better normal. People felt empowered. They knew their voices mattered. The HOA served the community instead of ruling it. I continued serving on the board, working with Tom and the other members to create positive change. We weren't perfect, but we were committed to doing better than our predecessors. One warm April evening, I was sitting on my back porch, looking at the remaining firewood stacked against my fence. I had burned through most of it during the winter, but enough remained to start next year's supply. I would begin stocking up again soon, and this time, nobody would find me for it. Tom stopped by with a 6-pack of beer. We sat on the porch, enjoying the spring weather and talking about the upcoming summer projects for the neighborhood. "You know," Tom said, "when all this started, I told you fighting the HOA was like fighting quicksand. I was wrong. Sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you win." I clinked my beer bottle against his. Sometimes the quicksand swallows the people who deserved it. We both laughed. It felt good to laugh about something that had caused so much stress and anger just months earlier. The propane shortage had been a crisis, but it had also been a catalyst for change. It exposed the flaws in our HOA's leadership and gave the community an opportunity to demand better. My decision to stockpile firewood, which had seemed paranoid or excessive to some, had proven to be wise preparation. More importantly, the whole experience taught me that standing up for principles mattered. I could have backed down, paid the fine, gotten rid of my firewood, and avoided all the conflict. But then Brenda and her board would have continued their petty tyranny unchecked. Other residents would have been targeted for equally absurd violations. The community would have suffered under poor leadership indefinitely. By fighting back, by refusing to be bullied, I had sparked a movement that transformed our neighborhood for the better. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I doubted myself, but it was worth it. As summer approached and the memory of the cold winter faded, I made sure to remind people about the importance of preparation. At board meetings and community gatherings, I emphasized learning from what had happened. We couldn't control external crises like propane shortages, but we could control how we prepared for them and how we treated each other during difficult times. The new board established an emergency preparedness committee to help residents plan for future disruptions. We created resource guides, organized workshops, and encouraged people to maintain reasonable supplies of essentials. The committee was popular and well attended. People appreciated having practical support instead of bureaucratic obstacles. I also began selling firewood to residents who wanted to build their own supplies. I partnered with a local supplier to offer bulk purchasing at fair prices. It became a small side business that helped people while earning me some extra income. The HOA even designated a section of the community storage area for residents who didn't have space on their properties for firewood. It was the kind of practical, helpful initiative that the old board never would have considered. By the time fall arrived and the weather began to cool again, Silverbrook Estates was a different place. Property values had actually increased, not because of strict aesthetic enforcement, but because people wanted to live in a community with reasonable leadership and strong neighborly bonds. Susan Carmichael, ironically, would have appreciated that outcome even if she had undermined it with her own actions. The propane supply remained stable, and prices returned to normal levels. But many residents, having learned their lesson, diversified their heating sources. Fireplace and wood stove sales increased throughout Boulder County. People installed backup systems and maintained emergency supplies. The crisis had taught everyone the value of preparation. I received a letter one day from the Colorado HOA Reform Coalition, asking if I would be willing to speak at a state conference about my experience. They wanted to use Silverbrook Estates as a case study in how communities could overcome bad HOA governance and implement positive reforms. I agreed, and in November I traveled to Denver to address a room full of homeowners, board members, and legislators. I told the story of the firewood fine, the propane shortage, Susan's arrest, and the community's transformation. People listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. After my presentation, several legislators approached me to discuss potential HOA reform legislation. They were considering bills that would increase transparency requirements, limit fine amounts, establish clear appeal processes, and create state oversight mechanisms. My story had provided real-world evidence of why such reforms were necessary. I never imagined that my decision to stockpile firewood would lead to testifying before state legislators, but life takes unexpected turns. The experience taught me that individual actions can have broader impacts. By standing up for myself, I had helped spark a conversation about HOA reform that extended far beyond my neighborhood. Back in Silverbrook Estates, the holiday season approached. The community organized a winter festival, complete with a bonfire, hot chocolate, and caroling. It was the kind of event that brought people together and celebrated what made our neighborhood special. As I stood by the bonfire, warming my hands and chatting with neighbors, I thought about how much had changed in a year. 12 months earlier, I had been fighting with Brenda Patterson over a pink violation slip. Now, I was serving on a functional, effective board, helping to create the kind of community people actually wanted to live in. Brenda showed up at the festival, surprisingly. She stood at the edges, alone, watching the festivities with an unreadable expression. Part of me felt sorry for her. She had wanted to lead and contribute, but her rigid thinking and inability to adapt had destroyed her reputation and influence. She was a cautionary tale about the dangers of petty authority. I considered approaching her, perhaps offering some gesture of reconciliation, but Tom caught my eye and shook his head slightly. Some wounds needed more time to heal. Maybe someday Brenda and I could have a civil conversation, but that day hadn't arrived yet. As winter settled in for real, I burned my firewood contentedly, secure in the knowledge that I had been right all along. The warmth of the fire was satisfying, but the warmth of knowing I had made a positive difference was even better. The HOA continued to function smoothly under the new board. We handled normal business efficiently, resolved disputes fairly, and kept the community maintained without being oppressive. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important. Good governance required diligence, fairness, and a genuine commitment to serving the community rather than ruling it. One evening in late December, almost exactly a year after the propane shortage had begun, Jennifer Walsh called me with unexpected news. "Greg, I wanted to let you know that the Colorado legislature is moving forward with HOA reform legislation, and they've named it the Homeowner Protection Act. Your testimony was cited specifically in the committee hearings. This is actually going to happen." I was stunned. "That's incredible. You should be proud," Jennifer said. "You turned a personal dispute into meaningful systemic change. That's rare." After we hung up, I sat in my living room, fire crackling, thinking about the journey. It had started with such a small thing, firewood. Something as simple and ancient as burning wood for heat had become the catalyst for personal vindication, community transformation, and potentially statewide reform. The Homeowner Protection Act passed in the spring legislative session and was signed into law by the governor in April. It included provisions limiting HOA fine amounts, requiring clear violation procedures, establishing appeal rights, and creating a state ombudsman office to handle HOA disputes. Colorado became a leader in HOA reform, and other states began considering similar legislation. I was invited to the bill signing ceremony, along with other advocates who had pushed for reform. Standing in the Capitol building, watching the governor sign the legislation, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was bigger than me, bigger than Silverbrook Estates, bigger than firewood. This was about protecting homeowners across the state from the kind of abuse I had experienced. Back home, life continued. The HOA board I served on became a model for other communities. We received requests from other neighborhoods asking for advice on governance reform. Tom and I joked that we had accidentally become HOA consultants, but we were happy to share what we had learned. The second winter after the propane crisis passed without incident. I had my firewood, properly stored and legal. Other residents had learned to prepare as well. The community was resilient and ready for whatever challenges might come. Susan Carmichael eventually moved away, unable to rebuild her life in a community where everyone knew what she had done. I didn't take pleasure in her departure, but I understood it. Sometimes the consequences of our actions make it impossible to stay in place. She sent me a final letter before leaving, thanking me for not making her legal situation worse and wishing me well. I appreciated the gesture. Brenda Patterson remained in the neighborhood, a quieter, diminished presence. I would see her occasionally at the grocery store or the community pool. We would nod politely but never spoke. Some relationships couldn't be repaired, and that was okay. Not every story ended with reconciliation. What mattered was that the community thrived. Property values continued to increase. New families moved in, attracted by the reasonable governance and strong community bonds. Silverbrook Estates became known as one of the best neighborhoods in Boulder, not because of strict rules, but because of common-sense leadership and mutual respect among residents. I served 2 full terms on the HOA board before deciding to step down and let fresh voices take over. By then, the reforms we had implemented were well established, and the community had fully embraced the new approach. My work was done. On my last day as a board member, the community held a small appreciation event. People thanked me for my service and for standing up when it mattered. Tom gave a speech about courage and principles, which embarrassed me but also made me proud. This was what community was supposed to be about. As I looked out at the faces of my neighbors, I thought about that morning when Brenda Patterson had showed up at my door with her clipboard and her fine. I never could have imagined where that moment would lead. A simple dispute over firewood had become a journey of advocacy, reform, and community building. The firewood itself, the physical cords of oak and pine that had started everything, was long since burned and replaced. But what it represented, the principle of preparation and the right to make reasonable decisions on your own property, that endured. The covenant amendments we passed, the statewide legislation we inspired, the example we set, all of it would outlast any of us individually. Sometimes the smallest things become the most important: a stack of firewood, a pink violation slip, a cold winter. These simple elements combine to create a story of conflict, resolution, and positive change. I was grateful to have been part of it, even though I never wanted the conflict in the first place. As I drove home from my last board meeting, I passed Brenda Patterson's house. The lights were on, and I could see her moving around inside. I wondered what she thought about everything that had happened, whether she had learned anything or still believed she had been right all along. I would probably never know, and that was fine. Her journey was her own. Mine had led me to this moment, to this place of satisfaction and completion. I had fought for what was right, endured the struggle, and come out the other side better for it. The community had transformed, Laws had changed, and people were protected in ways they hadn't been before. That evening, I built a fire in my fireplace, using wood from my legally stored, properly maintained supply. As the flames grew and warmth filled my home, I reflected on everything I had learned. Stand up for your principles. Don't back down from bullies. Document everything. Build alliances. Fight smart, not just hard. And never underestimate the power of being prepared. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing Silverbrook estates in white. Inside, I was warm and content, knowing that I had made a difference that would last long after the fire burned down and the snow melted. This was the end of one story, but the beginning of many others. Other homeowners in other communities would face their own battles with unreasonable HOAs. Some would remember the story of the firewood fine in Colorado and find inspiration to fight their own fights. The Homeowner Protection Act would shield thousands of families from abuse. The model of governance we established in Silverbrook Estates would be replicated elsewhere. All because I decided to stockpile firewood and refused to be pushed around when someone told me I couldn't. All because I believed in preparation, stood on principle, and fought for what was right. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world, or at least your corner of it. The fire burned low as the evening wore on. I added another log, watching the flames spring back to life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, I simply enjoyed the warmth and the satisfaction of a story well ended. The firewood had served its purpose, in more ways than one.